All right, Jackson, can you confirm or deny that you've got my opening slide?
Confirmed. Thank you.
Okay, others hopefully can see it too. Um, yeah, I guess without further ado, I'll kick it off. First and foremost, thanks again for all of you for taking the time to listen to the presentation, and thanks to the conference organizers for inviting me. Again, my name's Tom Rudolph. I'm a policy officer with Pew Charitable Trusts and based down in Portland, Oregon. Really pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you all today about what we view as an important emerging issue, which is seabed mining, and Pew's work to promote a more precautionary approach that'll better protect the marine ecosystem, including waters off Washington state. First, let me provide a little bit of background on the organization that I represent. Pew's a 501c3 NGO dedicated to serving the public interest. Most folks have heard of us through our longtime support for National Public Radio, or maybe the polling that's conducted by the Pew Research Center. But I suspect many in this audience, being so closely connected to ocean issues, are also aware of our environment programs. I have been a member of Pew's U.S. West Coast Oceans team for just about 10 years. And most of that time, we were focused on fisheries issues, dabbling a little bit in state work, actually mostly in Oregon and California, as opposed to Washington, which I think is a compliment to Washington's management of its state fisheries. And then definitely active in federal fisheries through the Pacific Fishery Management Council. But in recent years, we've taken on some new initiatives much more focused on protecting coastal habitat, including this seabed mining work. It was through our fisheries work that specifically some collaborations that we undertook with seafloor ecologists to better understand and address fishing gear impacts on the seafloor, that we first became aware of seabed mining as a domestic issue. For several years prior to that, even Pew had a seabed mining campaign focused on the high seas, international waters. Anyway, some of those scientists urged us to look closely at mining as a potentially bigger long-term threat than fisheries. And when we did, we ultimately agreed that some regulatory updates were needed. So the goals of my presentation today are, for the most part, educational. This issue is new, especially in the context of U.S., state, and federal waters. And so we want to give an overview of seabed mining, its effects, and our thoughts on how to better prepare for it, especially in the context of Washington state waters. So I'll start with 4 slides kind of giving an overview and an introduction to the issue. And I'd like to start with some distinctions that we think are useful, but it's important to understand that these distinctions are somewhat porous and overlapping, which is really a product of how new this issue is, and active rapid evolution that's taking place around the issue on all kinds of fronts: scientific, legal, policy, economic, and other arenas. First, it's useful to distinguish between hard minerals and SGS, also known as sand, gravel, and shell. And for the most part, when we say SGS, sand, gravel, and shell, we mean white sand, typically used in the construction industry for aggregate or for coastal erosion control like beach renourishment. And that typically is and has been the target of marine mining in many places around the world and around the country, and for many years. Sand mining is certainly an important issue in its own right, but the focus of our work is hard minerals. And by that, we mean, for the most part, rocks, especially phosphorus-bearing rocks, metal ores, but also certain metal-rich sands. Typically, these are black sands. There's also a useful, if somewhat blurry, distinction between nearshore and deep sea mineral deposits. Some of you may have heard of the big 3 offshore mineral targets, which are manganese nodules, cobalt-rich ferromanganese crusts, typically associated with seamounts, and seafloor massive sulfides, which are typically associated with hydrothermal vent activity. Now, 2 of those can actually be found in waters closer to shore, including within the U.S. exclusive economic zone, but our main focus is on different minerals likely to be found in the nearshore waters managed by the states, like black sands, rich in semi-precious metals and placer deposits of precious metals. And it is large-scale industrial operations targeting these resources, perhaps with equipment like the dredge ship in this photo, that we hope to prevent. We believe the forces driving the emergence of this industry on a global basis will eventually lead to prospecting and extraction interest closer to home. And I'd like to focus on the first two drivers of the global surge of interest in seabed mining for just a moment. I think the most salient point for the first bullet are the clear signals sent in the past few years by the US government that mineral extraction, including extraction from the ocean, is a very high priority. From the recent designation of a suite of minerals critical to economic and national security, including several known to exist in marine deposits, to a renewed focus on seafloor mapping, with one of the stated justifications being mineral surveys. A number of recent executive orders serve to demonstrate that the US government is not planning to rely on diminishing terrestrial or imported sources for these rocks in the face of increased demand. And when it comes to improving exploratory and extractive technology, I guess I can briefly mention that this is a trend that's been going on for many, many years, the improvement in drilling technology and deep sea technology related to oil and gas. And all these things are really serving to rapidly promote advances in the technology for that will ultimately be used for seabed mining. And then just to wrap up this slide, someone once told me you should have a picture on every PowerPoint slide. So sometimes I just throw one in randomly. And in this one here, this is a phosphorite nodule, which is a marine mineral type found in abundance off Southern California. So I'll come back to impacts a bit later in the context of the evolving scientific consensus on the risk related to this activity, but I just want to run through an overview of impacts really quickly. In a nutshell, they would be significant. Seabed mineral extraction would be by shallow dredging at best and by cutting or grinding of hard substrate at worst. The direct benthic impacts of the extraction would be locally severe, and new science points to potentially far-flung dispersed impacts from noise, and especially from the extraction and return plumes. The dredge itself kicks up a cloud, and on top of that, the collected slurry, a mix of rock, sediment, and water, that's typically dewatered on board the mining vessel, and the resulting discharge can be laced with fine sediments, toxic metal, also water that's a different temperature than the surrounding area where it's released. These impacts can be felt far up into the water column or far afield from the mined area as the plume is transported. And our featured photo on this page is marine snails that are endemic to hydrothermal vents. And these snails are unique and fascinating in at least 3 or 4 different ways. One of which is that they are they're the only animals that construct a shell from something other than calcium carbonate. They actually use iron, so they rust. And they're also the first animal to be declared at risk of extinction simply because of the risks of seabed mining activity. Next slide here is the last one of our 4-part overview. And it kind of sums up here. After looking at the risks and trends as well as current regulations, we launched an effort to shift the regional regulatory environment on seabed mining to a more protective one. Specifically, we found that 3 of the 4 major jurisdictions on the US West Coast currently have the door open to seabed mining for hard minerals. And those 3 would be the federal government, California, and Washington. In our view, the best place to start remedying this and the best merger of need and opportunity was to seek a proactive preemption on any new mining for hard minerals in state waters in California and Washington. You may note that Oregon is conspicuously absent, and that's because that's the 4th jurisdiction, and Oregon actually prohibited this activity, any new prospecting or extractive activity for hard minerals, almost 20 years ago. And our critter feature here is ventimestiferian tube worms. These are an important resident of chemosynthetic ecosystems associated with cold methane seeps, which are found in great abundance up and down the whole U.S. coast, including in state and federal waters of all 3 states. These are kind of the quiet cousins of those giant blood red tube worms that made global headlines in the 70s when hydrothermal vent communities were first discovered. So we touched on a little bit of this information already, but for those interested in a more comprehensive list of marine minerals of interest, this slide provides more examples. The photo here is of a manganese nodule. Those are especially attractive to mining interests because they're typically found just scattered about on abyssal plain habitats like pumpkins and gourds in a farm field, and they're notably rich in scarce valuable metals like nickel and copper. Of most interest for today would be this list of minerals typically found in nearshore areas. So I want to move on to what's out there and where is it. You know, globally, seabed mineral deposits are widespread and abundant, as we can see here, but I obviously want to zoom in on the US West Coast, this area that's now highlighted in red. And so that's excerpted and blown up here. And right away, we can see one of the challenges that we've faced in this work so far, and that is that information on seabed mineral deposits is A, sparse, and B, dated. You know, when I first saw this map, I assumed it was underlain by some rich GIS files, and I went looking for them, and I'm still looking. It's hard to find information on this stuff, and in the meantime, I'm kind of making do. And so this has been a useful overview map. And of interest here are some of these known deposits. The ones labeled MS, those are massive sulfides, again, associated with hydrothermal vents. The ones labeled CR are black chromite-rich sands. And though it's not directly relevant to Washington, all those X's down off Southern California and Baja California, that's your phosphorite nodules. This map here is one that we made with some of the very limited GIS data we did find. And this shows heavy mineral placers, for instance, gold or titanium, that are found off Washington. And here we can see that some are A, in state waters, and B, outside the protections of the Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary. And then finally, going way back to 1964, remember I warned you we were dealing with some older information. This map shows potentially valuable titanium-rich black sands found in Grays Harbor that were the subject of a Washington State geologist's report back in 1964. Going to move quickly through some illustrations that we developed to try and communicate the equipment and the impacts that this industry might feature if it ever came to the U.S. West Coast in the future. First, for the deposits found in shallow waters closest to shore, for instance, submarine placer deposits of gold or other metals, relatively small hydraulic dredges might be used. Now, some of you may have seen the show Bering Sea Gold on the Discovery Channel. And although those dredge vessels are smaller than this one and a little bit more DIY, it's a similar process. It would just expect that for corporate interest, it would come on a bigger scale. Now, for deposits that are deeper or that attract the attention of larger enterprises, large trailing suction hopper dredge ships would likely be employed. This is the technology planned for at least 3 recent very large-scale proposals to mine phosphorite rock that have been the subject of pretty bruising policy debates in other countries, specifically Namibia, New Zealand, and Mexico. These dredges can operate in far deeper water than the previous example. And in this illustration, you can also see the 2 separate sediment plumes, one from the drag head and one from the dewatering discharge. And finally, in deeper waters, mining the seafloor can involve processing ships and bottom crawlers. This is not, this use of tethered seafloor crawlers is not theoretical. Mining companies have working prototypes and examples of these machines, some that are well along into field testing. Recently, the Japanese state-owned Minerals Corporation conducted the first successful example of mining cobalt-rich crusts on seamount, and this is the crawler that they used. on the bottom of the slide here. So that brief return to impacts here that I mentioned I was going to do earlier, and it's mainly to illustrate one of the dynamics that's most striking to me about the state of the science on this issue, which is the pace and speed of the compelling findings about the seriousness of the impacts that this would cause. New science is coming out all the time. Science concluding that things like impacts have been broadly underestimated to date, that previous simulations of mining reveal almost no recovery 3 decades after the simulation. Same simulation that came back to it 3 decades later and also found that the microbial engine that drives much of the deep sea ecosystem is still in an impaired state. And a comprehensive synthesis of how the impacts are going to reverberate far up into the water column. And these 4 things are all in just the past year. So what's the current situation in Washington? We know there's surging global interest in seabed minerals and potentially valuable resources to be found, and that the regulatory door is open. And by that we mean the managing agency with jurisdiction over seabed minerals, which is the Washington Department of Natural Resources, does allow for mineral leasing applications on submerged lands off the coast. DNR would evaluate these applications on a case-by-case basis, but without the benefit of any comprehensive prior analysis of seabed mining or marine mining specific environmental standards. And, you know, even though the Washington Marine Spatial Plan recently adopted, you know, it does help in that it included some bulked up review criteria for marine activities. In our view, this is still a door that's open and really should be shut. The nearshore area managed, in this case by DNR, it's simply too valuable and vulnerable to allow for this type of high impact new industry, and it would put existing ocean industries and coastal communities at too much risk. It also may be very hard for DNR to say no. In our view, a proactive and preemptive prohibition is not only scientifically and legally justified, it would likely save DNR many hours of future staff time and resources analyzing and probably defending a negative finding on the suitability of the activity. But past history shows us that industrial enterprises of the size and scale that have the resources to mine underwater in the ocean, they generally don't easily take no for an answer. One of those phosphorite mining proposals I mentioned earlier off Baja, California, despite 2 permit denials by the Mexican government, the company seeking to mine phosphorite, they're not giving up. And in fact, they filed an arbitration claim under NAFTA seeking several $billions in restitution for what they view as an inappropriate denial of their prospective mining operation. And so I think I can wrap up. You know, again, I want to thank you all for this opportunity and thank the summit organizers for inviting me to give a presentation today. Happy to answer any questions, and I think this presentation likely will be posted somewhere, and it does include my contact information there if anybody wants to follow up or anything or has questions. So thank you again.
Tom, this is Doug, and I'm going to ask the same question I asked Mara. Would it be of help for us to get a common letter from the MRCs for attacking this issue going forward? And where would we send it?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Great question. Like I said, you know, mostly I think certainly, yeah, you know, any and all advocacy or support for what we're trying to accomplish as far as an outcome, which is sort of a preemptive prohibition, closing this regulatory door, is welcome and helpful. Whether that's something the MRCs typically do on their own or collectively, you know, I leave that all to you. And as far as where such a letter would be directed at this point, I think it's DNR. You know, they've confirmed to us that that you know, that the door is open. They would consider lease applications, and that they in theory at least have the authority to close the door. There are some questions over whether that's the best way to accomplish it, or whether some type of state legislation might be a better, a more sustainable long-term pathway. So, you know, at this point, I think we're a little bit agnostic and willing to look and listen at all potential procedural pathways. But for the moment, DNR as the managing agency would be where you'd send a letter. And, I think simply asking them to take a real close look at the regulatory regime and whether there's a better way to do things going forward would be a good message or something like that.
Can the governor slow this stuff down by executive order? Or?
Yeah, I think that's possible too. I think that there's not at least we haven't been able to uncover any sort of statutory or constitutional obstacle to the governor preemptively stopping this type of activity. But on the flip side, there's no constitutional or statutory authority to say that this would be a bad idea either. So, yeah, I think the governor could block something like this, but a hypothetical future governor could just as easily facilitate it.
Yep.
Thanks, Tom. Looks like we have, yeah, go ahead, Dale. So I was going to call.
You made one comment that I would like you to expound on a little bit if you could. You said it's hard to say no. Now, could you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, by that I just meant that once you get as far as somebody, an individual or a company, taking the time to develop and submit a complete lease application for something like this, there's already an investment. And that could be an investment of time, could be an investment of capital, could be an investment of equipment or into equipment. And I think it's just hard to say no at that point. Once you've got an existing industry, even if it's a nascent industry that's simply applying to start their activity, it's just that much harder to say no. We've been a big fan of these precautionary campaigns for a number of years. We've worked on one in Washington, with Washington fishery managers at the federal level for forage fish, oily bait fish that were not yet the subject of commercial fisheries, large-scale commercial fisheries. One of our first campaigns on the U.S. West Coast as a fisheries team was to try to do that. Now, that's another one where Washington already had a policy of that nature for the state and for state waters. And essentially our campaign was to say that Oregon, California, and federal fishery managers should replicate that on unmanaged forage fish. Because there wasn't yet an industry, and in cases where the science clearly supports the idea that new extractive activity would not be a great idea, we believe that that's the time to try to close that regulatory door, because it's easier to say no at that point, than later when somebody has an investment or an expectation that their proposed activity could potentially be approved.
Do you have any suggestions on some precautionary regulations as you listed them?
Yeah, ultimately, I think a regulation that says we won't mine, there won't be any mining for hard minerals on or under the seafloor on state submerged lands. I mean, that's essentially the regulation that we think is appropriate and necessary.
Tom, this is Tom Kolash. How did Oregon go about it? Was that a legislative prohibition?
It was, yeah. It was very short and sweet. In fact, the legislation's barely a half a page, maybe 200, 250 words. It was interesting, it was hard to find information on that too, because that was back in the days, when all stuff wasn't archived. I had to go down to Salem into the bowels of a state building and get a bunch of audio cassettes, and I'm still kind of pouring through it all. But as near as I can tell, that was sort of a very quickly mobilized all hands on deck effort, because a big ship showed up sniffing around for gold down off Gold Beach, Oregon, in Southern Oregon.
Tom, we have a question in the chat from Ann Skelton. You mentioned the U.S. Coastal Economic Zone. Can you clarify?
Yeah, sorry, I can't figure out how to get back to a full screen. Maybe it's because I'm still screen sharing, so I can't see the chat. But the question is, what's when I referred to the EEZ, U.S. Exclusive Economic Zone? So that's the area from the 3 mile line out to 200. And I should mention that our campaign is highly focused on state waters at the moment, and I kind of outlined a few of the reasons why we decided to start there, and I can go into more detail if you'd like. But we are all actually very interested in getting as protective a regulatory regime as we can for federal waters from 3 miles to 200 as well, including trying to do everything possible to have the state extend protective regulatory tentacles out into federal waters through the Coastal Zone Management Act. We've been sort of actively exploring some ideas for how to do that using geographic location descriptions or enforceable policies or some of the other things under the CZMA. Now I can see the chat.
All right, you can see it now? You good?
Yeah, there's another question here from Christy. If the governor is inclined to stop continental shelf activities, what is the most important guardrail they lean on now? Yeah, I'd have to say the CZMA, right? Enforceable policies in the state's coastal zone management program. If the question is referring to beyond 3 miles, yeah. You know, but it's difficult because you know, CZMA is fascinating whole new area, and it's kind of new to us at Pew, like I said, because we kind of made this shift into coastal habitat just about a year and a half ago, and so we're still learning. But one of the things that's challenging is the state's powers in federal waters under the CZMA. They're great, but they're not super consistent with straight prohibitions. So we're in a bit of a pickle because the ultimate outcome we seek is prohibitive. We don't think seabed mining is a good idea, especially close to shore. So it's challenging, but I would say CZMA is the answer to that question.
Tom, that lines up a lot with issues that the MRC has been dealing with our shoreline master plan update. We've had the first ocean unit on the coast here, and you know, heard the same thing about offshore structures. You know, trying to put reasonable limits, and if we could, maybe even prohibit those where, you know, we've got such limited fishing area in this part of the state, given the limits and, you know, up north in the national monument and such, and putting any kind of structures out there could really, you know, limit our ability to fish out there. And we struggled with the same kind of things and are still struggling. You know, we put forward a, you know, it's not prohibitive, but we tried to really put, you know, reasonable constraints and approval processes, I guess you might say, in our SMP, and we're struggling to get the state to then actually forward that on to NOAA to get approved within the CZMA. So the enforceability doesn't really happen until that happens.
Yeah, I hear you. Would that there was, you know, more time, more staff, more money, the whole shebang, you know, because I think it's challenging to try to get. It's challenging. You know, we had a conversation with folks at DNR that talked about the challenges of trying to get all the different state regulations with impacts on the ocean. Maybe I'm saying the same thing as you are, to get them all incorporated into the state's coastal management program. It's a huge task. It's a big lift, and never enough resources to get it all done, right?
Yep, exactly.
Can I step in here just for a second, Frank Wolfe? Are you hearing me?
Yeah, we hear you, Frank.
Okay, I was just going to say, I'm one of the county commissioners here in Pacific County. When we did the SMP, which we were required to do several years ago, they hammered away at, well, we had a deadline, we had to get it done because it had to be in, and, the state can't do anything until, and we were late, and blah, 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 blah. So we got it done. We incorporated, as has been referred to, a section which essentially outlawed any kind of structures out in the part of the ocean that we can actually do that in. But we also figured, but when the state incorporates this into the state SMP, then we better be thinking in terms of going out as far as we can. They have not yet, and this is several years, they have not yet accepted our SMP. They have not yet made it part of the state SMP. They came back to us and told us they can't do that because ours needs to fall in line with the state SMP. We said, that's not what statute says. Statute says the state SMP is a compilation of all the county SMPs. And we've been at that stalemate for quite a while. We don't want to drop it out. This is with ecology, not so much DNR, but that's who's running the process for us. It's very frustrating because I know darn well that in a few more years, guess what? They're going to want another update, and they're not going to like it. So if there's anything we can do at our end to help push this through and make that part of the state SMP so that the state, not the county, is the guy who's standing there saying, no, you can't put your oil rig out there or your floating windmill or whatever. I'd sure appreciate a heads up. That's all I got.
Yeah, well, thanks. Well, and it's early days for us kind of trying to get this work going, and I hear you. I've often in my years doing conservation campaigns, you often have the real hard work is, you can have very consensus or very close to it on the outcome, but sometimes it's still so hard and takes years and years of work to try to figure out the pathway. The procedural pathway. So I encourage you to just keep at it. I know it's not the. I know it's hard to hear, but if you got to, I think what you were saying is they're not going to like the next update because it's going to say the same thing. Sometimes that's what it takes, right? You got to ask again and again and again.